The headlights caught nothing but white. Clara Whitfield gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale, as the wind slammed against her small car and pushed it sideways across the icy road. She had left the diner 20 minutes ago, exhausted after a 10-hour shift, and now the storm that the weather report had called light snow had turned into something far more dangerous. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The wipers could not keep up with the snow piling on the windshield, and the road ahead disappeared into a swirling gray curtain. Her phone had no signal out here on the Ridge Road, a narrow mountain pass that connected her small town to the highway. She had taken this route 100 times before, but never in weather like this. Her heart pounded as she eased her foot off the gas, terrified that even a small mistake could send her off the edge of the mountain. Then she saw it. A flash of red taillight, barely visible through the storm, tilted at a strange angle just off the road. She slowed the car to a crawl and squinted through the windshield. It was a vehicle, flipped on its side, half buried in a snowbank near the guardrail. Steam or smoke rose faintly from the engine, curling into the freezing air. Clara's first instinct was fear. Her second was to keep driving, to find help, to call someone. But there was no one to call. No signal. No other cars. Just her, the storm, and whoever might be trapped inside that wreck. She pulled over as carefully as she could, her tires slipping on the ice, and stepped out into the biting wind. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing the breath from her lungs. Snow immediately soaked through her thin work shoes. She trudged toward the overturned car, her heart hammering, calling out to see if anyone would answer. Silence, except for the wind. She reached the car and peered through the shattered driver's side window. Inside, slumped against the seatbelt, was a man. Older, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and a face pale from cold and shock. Blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow, already beginning to freeze at the edges. His eyes were closed. Clara's training from a first aid class years ago rushed back to her. She checked for breathing. Shallow, but present. She checked his pulse. Weak, but there. She knew she could not wait for help that might never come in time. The cold alone could kill him within the hour. She had to act now. Working quickly, her fingers numb and clumsy, she managed to unbuckle his seatbelt and pull him free from the wreckage. He was heavier than she expected, dead weight, against her much smaller frame, but adrenaline gave her strength she did not know she had. She dragged him through the snow, inch by painful inch, back toward her car. By the time she got him into the passenger seat, her arms were shaking, and her lungs burned from the cold air. She climbed into the driver's seat, cranked the heat as high as it would go, and looked at the stranger beside her. His face was ghostly pale. She had no idea who he was. No wallet visible, nothing to identify him. All she knew was that if she did not get him to a hospital soon, he might not survive the night. She turned the car around, praying the tires would hold their grip on the ice, and began the slow, terrifying drive back down the mountain. Every few seconds she glanced at the man beside her, watching his chest rise and fall, whispering for him to hold on. The drive that should have taken 20 minutes took nearly an hour. The storm fought her the entire way, but Clara refused to let fear take over. She thought only of the hospital lights waiting somewhere below the mountain, and she pushed forward through the white nothing. When the town finally came into view, faint lights glowing through the snow, she nearly cried with relief. She followed the signs to the small regional hospital, pulled up to the emergency entrance, and ran inside screaming for help. Nurses and a doctor rushed out with a stretcher. They lifted the man carefully and wheeled him inside, firing questions at Clara. What happened? Who was he? Was she hurt too? She answered as best she could, explaining the crash, the Ridge Road, the blizzard. She had no answers about his identity. She had simply found him and brought him here. A nurse asked for her name so they could contact her if needed. Clara gave it, but her mind was elsewhere, still replaying the moment she had pulled him from the wreck. She sat in the waiting room for almost 2 hours, soaked and freezing, waiting for any word. Finally, a doctor came out and told her the man was stable. He had suffered a concussion, a fractured wrist, and mild hypothermia, but he would live. If she had not found him when she did, the doctor said quietly, he likely would not have survived the night. Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed almost immediately by a strange kind of detachment. She did not know this man. She had done what anyone should do in that situation. She did not need thanks or recognition. She simply wanted to go home, change out of her wet clothes, and sleep. She gave the front desk her contact information in case the hospital needed anything further, then quietly slipped out into the night before anyone could ask more questions. She never saw the man's face again that night, never learned his name, never imagined that the stranger she had saved was about to change the direction of her entire life. As she drove home through the last of the storm, exhausted beyond words, she had no idea that behind her, in a hospital room lit by soft fluorescent light, a man named Edmund Ashworth was slowly waking up, and the first words out of his mouth would set off a search that would reach every corner of the region by morning. She had no idea that the man she pulled from the snow controlled one of the largest estates in the state, a sprawling property with vineyards, staff, and a family fortune that stretched back 3 generations. She had no idea that his household, his lawyers, and his estranged daughter were about to learn what happened on the Ridge Road, and that they would not rest until they found the woman who saved him. Clara arrived home just before dawn. She peeled off her frozen clothes, wrapped herself in a blanket, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, completely unaware that her quiet, ordinary life was about to be turned upside down by a decision she made in the middle of a snowstorm, a decision she had made without a second thought, simply because someone needed help and she happened to be the one who found them. The snow continued to fall outside her window long after she had drifted off, blanketing the town in silence, hiding the tracks of her car, and erasing any trace of the accident on the Ridge Road. But some things, once set in motion, cannot be erased so easily. And somewhere across town, in a hospital room she would never have imagined stepping into, a man was asking the nurses one question over and over. Who saved me? Nobody could answer him yet. But by morning, that question would begin to unravel a chain of events that would bring Clara Whitfield face to face with a world she never expected to enter, and a truth about the Ashworth family that not even Edmund himself fully understood. Edmund Ashworth opened his eyes to a white ceiling and the steady beep of a heart monitor. His body ached in places he did not know could ache, and his head throbbed with a dull, heavy pain that made it difficult to think clearly. A nurse noticed him stirring and hurried to his side, checking his vitals and speaking softly, telling him he was safe, that he was in the hospital, that he had been in an accident. Edmund tried to piece together what had happened. He remembered driving home from a business dinner, the snow falling harder than expected, the road curving sharply near the ridge. Then nothing, a blank space where memory should have been. He asked the nurse how he had gotten there. She explained that a young woman had found him in his crashed car, pulled him out in the middle of the storm, and driven him to the hospital herself. She had likely saved his life. Edmund's chest tightened at the thought. A stranger had risked her own safety, in a blizzard, on a dangerous mountain road, to help him. He asked for her name. The nurse checked the intake records and found only a first name, Clara, along with a phone number that had already gone unanswered when they tried to call for a follow-up. No last name had been recorded properly in the chaos of the emergency room that night. No address, nothing more. Edmund felt a strange mixture of gratitude and frustration. Someone had saved his life and vanished before he could even thank her. He was not a man accustomed to owing anyone anything, and the idea that a stranger had done something so selfless, without asking for recognition, without staying to be thanked, unsettled him deeply. Word of the accident traveled quickly once Edmund's assistant arrived at the hospital that morning. Edmund Ashworth was not an anonymous man. His family had owned Ashworth Estate for 3 generations, a sprawling property with vineyards, orchards, and a manor house that had been featured in regional magazines for its history and architecture. His name carried weight in business circles, and any accident involving him was bound to draw attention. By midday, his daughter Margaret arrived at the hospital, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor as she rushed to his room. Margaret and Edmund's relationship had grown distant over the years, strained by old disagreements about the family business, and, more recently, about the direction of the estate's future. Still, the news of her father's accident had shaken her enough to come immediately. She listened as the doctor explained Edmund's condition, then turned to her father with a mixture of relief and irritation. She wanted to know why he had been driving alone in such weather, why he had not called for a car service as she had suggested many times before. Edmund brushed off her concern, more focused on the mystery of the woman who had saved him. He asked Margaret to help find her. Margaret hesitated, unsure why it mattered so much to him, but agreed to have the household staff look into it. She assumed it would be a simple matter of checking hospital records and making a few phone calls. She did not yet understand how much this search would come to matter to her father, or how much it would eventually change the dynamic within their family. The Ashworth household staff began their search that same afternoon. Reginald, the estate's longtime butler and one of Edmund's most trusted employees, was tasked with the effort. He started by contacting the hospital directly, but the incomplete records provided little to go on. A first name, an unanswered phone number, and a vague description from the nurses who had spoken with her that night. Reginald expanded the search to the surrounding towns, reasoning that a local woman driving on the Ridge Road late at night was likely a resident nearby, rather than someone passing through. He contacted local businesses, described the situation carefully, without revealing too many details, and asked if anyone recognized a young woman named Clara, who might have been driving that route during the storm. Meanwhile, Edmund remained in the hospital for observation, his mind constantly returning to the mystery of his rescuer. He found himself unable to focus on anything else, not the stack of business documents his assistant brought him, not even Margaret's attempts to discuss the estate's upcoming plans. He kept thinking about the young woman who had pulled him from a wrecked car, in the middle of a blizzard, and asked for nothing in return. Margaret noticed her father's unusual preoccupation, and grew quietly concerned. She had rarely seen him this focused on anything unrelated to business. She wondered aloud to Reginald whether this search was truly about gratitude, or whether her father was searching for something else entirely, some connection he felt he owed after coming so close to losing his life. Reginald, ever the diplomat, reassured her that Edmund simply wanted to properly thank the woman who saved him. It was, after all, a reasonable thing for any person to want. Margaret was not entirely convinced, but she did not push the matter further. 2 days passed with no solid leads. The hospital's incomplete records made the search frustratingly slow. Reginald began driving through the small towns near the Ridge Road himself, stopping at diners, gas stations, and shops, asking quiet questions, showing no urgency that might draw unwanted attention or gossip. On the third day, he stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with worn booths and a menu that had not changed in years. He ordered a coffee and struck up a conversation with the waitress behind the counter, mentioning that he was trying to locate a young woman named Clara, who might have been involved in a car accident rescue during the recent storm. The waitress's eyes widened slightly. She told him that a woman named Clara Whitfield worked there, and that she had mentioned something about helping a stranger during the blizzard, though she had not gone into much detail. She said Clara was quiet about it, almost as if she did not think it was a big deal. Reginald felt a surge of excitement mixed with disbelief at how simple the final piece of the search had turned out to be. He asked when Clara's next shift was, careful not to reveal too much about who he worked for, or why he was really looking for her. The waitress told him Clara would be in the following afternoon. Reginald returned to the estate that evening and reported his findings to Edmund, who insisted on knowing everything, every detail, no matter how small. Margaret listened from the doorway, arms crossed, watching her father's reaction carefully. She noticed the way his expression softened at the mention of Clara's name, the way his eyes lit up in a manner she had not seen in years. Edmund instructed Reginald to approach Clara respectfully, without pressure, simply to thank her formally, and see if she would be willing to visit the estate so he could express his gratitude in person. He did not want to overwhelm her, did not want to make her feel obligated. He simply wanted the chance to properly acknowledge what she had done for him. Margaret, still skeptical, offered to accompany Reginald to make the introduction herself, curious to meet this woman who had captured her father's attention so completely. Reginald agreed, though he privately hoped Margaret's presence would not make the encounter feel more intimidating than it needed to be. That night, as the estate settled into its usual quiet routine, Edmund lay awake in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought Clara Whitfield into his life. He did not know yet how much that single snowy night would come to shape the months ahead, how the simple act of kindness from a stranger would eventually collide with old family tensions, unresolved questions about his estate, and secrets that had been buried for years within the walls of Ashworth Estate. He only knew that he needed to meet her, to look her in the eyes, and to say thank you. What came after that, he could not yet imagine. miles away, unaware that she had just become the subject of a quiet search led by one of the wealthiest families in the region. Clara Whitfield finished another ordinary shift at the diner, tired and unaware that her life was about to change in ways she never could have predicted. Clara wiped down the counter at the diner, her mind on nothing more urgent than the pile of dishes waiting in the back and the ache in her feet from standing all morning. The bell above the door chimed, and she glanced up out of habit to greet the new customers. A man in a neat gray coat walked in, followed by a woman dressed sharply in a tailored blazer, both of them looking noticeably out of place among the diner's regular crowd of truckers and farmers. The man approached the counter and asked politely if she was Clara Whitfield. Something in his tone made her pause, her heart skipping with a flicker of nerves. She confirmed that she was, wondering if something was wrong, if perhaps she had left something at the hospital that night, or if there had been some kind of mix-up with the paperwork. The man introduced himself as Reginald, explaining that he worked for a family whose relative Clara had helped during the recent snowstorm. Clara's confusion deepened for a moment before realization struck her. The man in the wrecked car. She had almost forgotten how strange that night had felt, how quickly it had passed into memory once she made it home and collapsed into sleep. Reginald explained, choosing his words carefully, that the man she had saved was Edmund Ashworth, owner of Ashworth Estate. Clara had heard the name before, vaguely, the way anyone in the region might recognize a name attached to old money and a sprawling property on the hillside outside town, but she had never had any real connection to that world. The woman beside Reginald introduced herself as Margaret, Edmund's daughter, her expression polite but reserved, studying Clara with a kind of careful curiosity that made Clara feel slightly uncomfortable, as though she were being evaluated rather than simply thanked. Reginald explained that Edmund wanted to personally thank Clara for saving his life and had asked if she would be willing to visit the estate, at her convenience, so he could express his gratitude properly. She had not done anything special in her mind, simply what any decent person would do when they found someone injured and in danger. She told them she appreciated the offer, but did not feel it was necessary. She had only done what anyone should do. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly at this response, clearly not expecting someone to turn down an invitation to visit one of the wealthiest estates in the region. Reginald, sensing Clara's hesitation came from humility rather than disinterest, gently reassured her that Edmund simply wanted the chance to say thank you in person, nothing more. He explained how much it would mean to a man who rarely felt indebted to anyone, and how the entire household had been searching for days just to find her. Clara finally agreed, more out of curiosity than any desire for recognition. She arranged to visit the following afternoon after her shift ended, still uncertain what to expect from a world so far removed from her own quiet, modest life. The next day, Clara drove up the long, winding driveway leading to Ashworth Estate, her old car looking painfully out of place among the manicured hedges and stone fountains lining the path. The manor house came into view, a grand structure of stone and glass that looked more like something from a magazine than a place real people actually lived in. She parked near the entrance, smoothing down her simple sweater and jeans, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance compared to the elegance surrounding her. A member of the household staff greeted her at the door and led her through a wide hallway lined with paintings and polished wood floors, toward a sitting room where Edmund waited, still recovering, his arm in a sling and a bandage visible near his hairline. When he saw her, his expression shifted into something Clara had not expected. Genuine emotion, gratitude so raw it seemed to catch him off guard. He rose slowly to greet her, thanking her repeatedly, his voice thick with sincerity, as he described how close he had come to not surviving that night, and how he owed everything to her quick thinking and courage. Clara felt oddly embarrassed by the intensity of his gratitude. She insisted she had simply done what anyone would do, that she did not deserve such elaborate thanks. Edmund shook his head firmly, telling her that not everyone would have stopped on a dangerous road during a blizzard to help a stranger, that most people would have driven past, assuming someone else would handle it, or fearing for their own safety too much to act. They talked for nearly an hour, Edmund asking about her life, her work at the diner, her family, genuinely interested in a way that surprised Clara. She had expected polite formality, a brief thank you, perhaps a gift or a reward she would need to graciously decline. Instead, she found herself in an easy conversation with a man who, despite his wealth and status, seemed remarkably down to earth once you stripped away the surface of his world. Margaret observed the interaction from across the room, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She noted the way her father's demeanor had changed since Clara's arrival, more animated, more present than she had seen him in years. Part of her was glad to see him happy, especially after everything he had endured, but another part of her felt a growing unease she could not quite explain. She had spent years watching people try to get close to her father because of his wealth, distant relatives suddenly reappearing, business partners offering favors with hidden strings attached, even a few romantic interests whose affections seemed to align suspiciously well with the size of the family fortune. She wondered, despite Clara's humble reaction and obvious reluctance to accept any reward, whether this woman's intentions were truly as simple as they appeared. Later, after Clara had left the estate, Margaret raised her concerns with Reginald, questioning whether it was wise to let a stranger, however well-meaning, become so closely involved with her father so quickly. Reginald reminded her gently that Clara had asked for nothing, had even tried to avoid coming to the estate at all, and that such behavior did not align with someone looking to take advantage of the situation. Margaret was not entirely convinced, but she chose not to push the matter further that evening, not wanting to dampen her father's improved spirits after everything he had been through. Meanwhile, other members of the household staff had their own opinions about the sudden appearance of Clara Whitfield in their carefully ordered world. Some found her rescue of Edmund genuinely admirable, a rare act of selflessness in a household often surrounded by people motivated by personal gain. Others, more cynical from years of working within wealthy families and witnessing schemes unfold, quietly speculated about her true motives, wondering how long it would take before requests for money or favors began to surface. Clara, unaware of the whispers circulating behind closed doors, drove home that evening with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling in her chest. She had gone to the estate expecting a brief, awkward meeting, a polite thank you, and nothing more. Instead, she found herself unexpectedly moved by Edmund's genuine warmth, and even more surprised by how easily their conversation had flowed, as though the massive gap between their worlds had barely mattered once they started talking. She told herself it did not matter, that this had been a one-time visit, a closing chapter to an unusual night in the snow. She had her own life to return to, her own routine, her own modest apartment and diner shifts waiting for her the next morning. But as she pulled into her driveway that night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Edmund, having gotten her contact information from Reginald, asking if she would be willing to visit again sometime, not out of obligation, but simply because he had genuinely enjoyed their conversation and hoped to know her better. Clara stared at the message for a long moment, unsure what to feel. Part of her wanted to decline, to keep the boundary between her simple life and the Ashworth family's complicated world firmly intact. But another part of her, the same part that had pulled a stranger from a wrecked car in the middle of a blizzard without a second thought, found herself curious about where this unexpected connection might lead. She typed a short reply, agreeing to visit again the following week, unaware that this simple decision would draw her deeper into a world of old family tensions, hidden resentments, and a fortune that many people within the Ashworth household believed was rightfully theirs to control. Tensions that had existed long before she ever appeared, and that her presence, however innocent, was about to bring closer to the surface than they had been in years. Over the following weeks, Clara's visits to Ashworth Estate became a regular occurrence. What started as a single afternoon of gratitude slowly grew into something more comfortable, almost familiar. Edmund looked forward to her visits more than he cared to admit, finding in her company a kind of honesty he rarely encountered among the people who normally surrounded him. Most of the people in Edmund's life wanted something from him, a business deal, a favor, access to his connections or his money. Clara wanted none of it. She still refused every gift he tried to offer her, brushing off his attempts to repay her kindness with expensive gestures. She seemed content simply talking with him, asking about his work in the vineyards, listening to stories about the estate's history, sharing details about her own modest upbringing in return. Edmund found himself recovering faster than his doctors expected, crediting much of it to the renewed sense of purpose Clara's visits brought him. He had spent years feeling disconnected from his own life, going through the motions of managing the estate and the family business without any real joy in it. Clara's presence reminded him what it felt like to genuinely enjoy another person's company, without any hidden agenda clouding the interaction. Margaret watched this developing friendship with growing unease. She had tried, in the weeks since Clara's first visit, to give her father the benefit of the doubt, to trust that his judgment remained sound, despite his recent brush with death. But the more time Clara spent at the estate, the more Margaret found herself questioning what exactly this young woman wanted from their family. She began asking pointed questions during Clara's visits, subtle at first, about her background, her financial situation, her plans for the future. Clara answered honestly each time, seemingly unbothered by the interrogation, which only made Margaret more suspicious. She had expected defensiveness, evasion, something that would confirm her fears. Instead, Clara's straightforward honesty left her with nothing solid to point to. Reginald, who had grown fond of Clara during the weeks of her visits, tried to ease Margaret's concerns whenever he could. He reminded her that not everyone who entered their world was after something, that some people truly acted out of kindness without expecting anything in return. Margaret wanted to believe him, but years of guarding her father's interests had made her instinctively cautious of anyone who got too close too quickly. Beneath the surface tension surrounding Clara's growing presence at the estate, older problems within the Ashworth family were beginning to resurface. Edmund's accident had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about the future of the estate, questions that had been avoided for years. Edmund had never finalized a proper will, a fact that had quietly worried Margaret and the household staff for a long time, especially given the size and complexity of the family's holdings. With Edmund's recent brush with death fresh in everyone's mind, the household's legal advisor gently raised the subject again, urging Edmund to formalize his estate plans before another accident or health scare left the family in legal chaos. Edmund, still somewhat in denial about his own mortality, despite everything that had happened, kept putting off the conversation, frustrating both Margaret and the advisor. This unfinished business created an undercurrent of anxiety among certain members of the household staff, some of whom had worked for the family for decades and had informal understandings about their future security that had never been put into writing. The uncertainty bred quiet whispers among the staff, speculation about who might benefit and who might be left with nothing if something happened to Edmund before proper arrangements were made. Clara remained largely unaware of these deeper tensions simmering beneath the polished surface of the estate. She continued visiting simply because she enjoyed Edmund's company, unaware that her presence had become entangled, at least in the minds of some, with the unresolved question of the family's future. One afternoon, while walking through the estate's expansive gardens with Edmund, Clara noticed a wing of the manor house that appeared closed off, its windows covered, and the door locked. Curious, she asked about it. Edmund's expression grew distant for a moment, before he explained that it had once been his late wife's favorite part of the house, closed up since her passing many years earlier. He rarely spoke of his wife, and Clara sensed the weight of unspoken grief behind his brief explanation. She did not push further, simply listening as he shared a few more details about his late wife, about the early years of building the estate together, about the plans they had once made for the property that never fully came to be. Clara found herself moved by his vulnerability, by the way he trusted her with pieces of his life he rarely shared with anyone. Margaret, watching from a distance through one of the manor's tall windows, saw the two of them walking together through the garden, deep in conversation, and felt a pang of something complicated, part jealousy, part grief of her own. She had lost her mother too, and had spent years watching her father retreat further into himself, rather than deal with that loss. Seeing him open up to Clara, a virtual stranger, stirred old wounds Margaret had never fully processed herself. That evening, Margaret confronted her father directly, asking him plainly what his intentions were with Clara. Edmund seemed surprised by the question, insisting that he simply valued her friendship, that there was nothing more calculated happening between them. Margaret pressed further, reminding him of his responsibility to the estate, to the family legacy, to finally addressing the unfinished will before something else happened. Edmund, growing frustrated, told Margaret that he understood his responsibilities, but refused to let fear dictate every decision he made. He reminded her that his near-death experience had taught him the value of genuine connection, something he felt he had been missing for years while buried in business matters and estate management. He told her that Clara represented something rare and honest in his life, and he did not intend to push her away simply because her arrival had made others uncomfortable. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving both father and daughter frustrated and unheard. Margaret retreated to her room that night, torn between wanting her father's happiness and fearing the complications his new friendship might bring to an already fragile family situation. Meanwhile, among the household staff, whispers about Clara's growing influence over Edmund began to spread more openly. A few staff members, worried about their own positions within the household should the family dynamic shift unexpectedly, began quietly discussing what they knew about Clara, exaggerating small details, speculating about motives that did not exist, planting seeds of doubt that would soon grow into something far more damaging. Clara remained oblivious to the storm quietly building around her, continuing to visit Edmund with the same simple sincerity she had shown from the very beginning. She had no idea that her presence had become a lightning rod for tensions that had existed within the Ashworth family long before she ever arrived. Tensions about money, about loyalty, about unresolved grief, and fear of the future. She only knew that she had found an unexpected friendship with a man who, despite his wealth and status, treated her with genuine warmth and respect, something she valued deeply regardless of the complicated world surrounding him. She could not have imagined that this same friendship, so simple and honest in her eyes, was about to become the center of an accusation that would threaten everything she had built and force her to question whether she belonged in the Ashworth family's world at all. The rumor started small, a whispered comment in the kitchen among two staff members who had grown uneasy about Clara's frequent visits to the estate. One of them, a housekeeper named Eleanor who had worked for the Ashworth family for nearly 15 years, mentioned to a friend outside the household that she suspected the young woman who saved Edmund had orchestrated the entire rescue as a way to work her way into the family's fortune. The claim was baseless, born more from Eleanor's own insecurity about her position within the household than any real evidence, but rumors rarely need evidence to spread. Within days, the story had grown far beyond its original form, twisted and exaggerated with each retelling, until it barely resembled the truth at all. By the time it reached a local gossip column that specialized in stories about the region's wealthier families, the narrative had transformed entirely. The article suggested that Clara Whitfield had staged the entire accident, perhaps even sabotaged Edmund's vehicle herself, in an elaborate scheme to gain access to his fortune through manufactured heroism. The piece was filled with vague insinuations rather than facts, but it spread quickly through the small town, exactly the kind of scandalous story people love to discuss over morning coffee. Clara found out about the article when a regular customer at the diner slid a printed copy across the counter, asking her with obvious curiosity whether the rumors were true. Clara's stomach dropped as she read through the accusations, her hands trembling with a mixture of shock and anger. She had done nothing but help a stranger in danger, and now she was being painted as a manipulative schemer, looking to exploit a vulnerable, injured man. Word spread through the diner quickly, customers whispering among themselves, some giving her sympathetic looks, while others eyed her with newfound suspicion. Her manager, worried about the diner's reputation amid the growing scandal, asked her to take a few days off until things settled down, a request that felt like a punishment despite his careful wording. Clara drove home that evening in a daze, replaying every interaction she had ever had with Edmund and his family, searching for any moment that might have been misconstrued or twisted into evidence supporting the accusation against her. She found nothing, because there was nothing to find. She had never asked Edmund for anything, had refused every gift, had simply enjoyed his company, because it felt genuine and rare in her otherwise ordinary life. At the estate, news of the scandal reached Edmund quickly, and his reaction was immediate fury. He demanded to know who had started the rumor, insisting that whoever spread such baseless accusations against Clara would face serious consequences. Margaret, despite her earlier suspicions about Clara's motives, found herself equally outraged on Clara's behalf, surprised by her own strong reaction to seeing an innocent woman dragged through public humiliation over something that clearly was not true. Reginald began quietly investigating the source of the rumor, speaking privately with members of the household staff, trying to trace the story back to its origin. It did not take long before Eleanor's involvement came to light, her careless words to a friend having spiraled far beyond anything she had intended. When confronted, Eleanor broke down, admitting she had spoken out of frustration and insecurity, never expecting her comments to reach a journalist or grow into such a damaging public scandal. Edmund, though angry, chose not to fire Eleanor immediately. understanding that the situation had grown beyond her control the moment it left her lips. Instead, he focused his energy on finding a way to publicly clear Clara's name before the damage became permanent. Clara, unaware of the investigation happening at the estate, spent the following days in near isolation, avoiding public spaces, screening her calls, watching helplessly, as the rumor continued to spread through local social media groups and community forums. Strangers she had never met left cruel comments about her character, accusing her of things she had never done, painting her as a gold digger, preying on a grieving, vulnerable widower. The emotional toll began to wear on her deeply. She had always prided herself on being a straightforward, honest person, someone who did the right thing without expecting recognition or reward. To see her name and reputation destroyed so completely, based entirely on lies, left her feeling hollow and betrayed by a town she had lived in her entire life. She considered cutting off all contact with the Ashworth family entirely, reasoning that if she simply disappeared from their world, the scandal might fade away on its own, and she could quietly rebuild her life away from the public eye. She began drafting a message to Edmund, explaining that she thought it best if they no longer stayed in contact, that the complications her presence had brought to his family were not worth the friendship they had built. Before she could send the message, her phone rang. It was Edmund, his voice firm but gentle, asking her to come to the estate immediately, promising that he had something important to share with her. Clara hesitated, exhausted and emotionally drained, but something in his tone convinced her to go. When she arrived, she found not just Edmund and Margaret waiting for her, but Reginald as well, along with a local reporter Edmund had personally invited to hear the full truth directly from those involved. Clara felt a fresh wave of anxiety, unsure what to expect, until Edmund began speaking, his voice steady and resolute. He explained, in front of everyone present, exactly what had happened on the night of the accident, how Clara had risked her own safety during a dangerous blizzard to save a complete stranger, asking for nothing in return, refusing every gift he had offered since. He detailed the investigation that had traced the false rumor back to a misunderstanding within his own household, making clear that Clara had done nothing wrong, that the accusations against her were entirely baseless and deeply unfair. Margaret spoke as well, admitting openly that she had initially harbored her own suspicions about Clara's motives, but that spending time around her had shown nothing but genuine kindness and honesty, free of any hidden agenda. Her willingness to publicly admit her earlier doubts, and to now defend Clara so firmly, meant more to Clara than she expected. The reporter took detailed notes, promising to publish a follow-up article correcting the record and clearing Clara's name publicly. Clara stood in the room, overwhelmed by the show of support, tears welling in her eyes, as the weight of the past several days finally began to lift from her shoulders. Still, even as the truth began to spread, and the harshest of the rumors started to fade, Clara found herself deeply shaken by how quickly her life had been turned upside down, simply because she had chosen to help someone in need. She wondered whether staying connected to the Ashworth family was worth the constant scrutiny that seemed to come with their world, whether she would ever be able to simply live her ordinary life again without being pulled into complications far beyond her control. Edmund, sensing her hesitation, asked her privately, after the reporter had left, whether she still wanted to end their friendship as she had originally planned. Clara looked at him for a long moment, searching for the right words, uncertain whether she had the strength to remain part of a world that had already caused her so much pain. She told him honestly that she needed time to think, that the events of the past week had left her exhausted and unsure of what she truly wanted. Edmund nodded, telling her he understood completely and would respect whatever decision she made, that he only wanted her happiness, regardless of whether that happiness included him or his family moving forward. Clara left the estate that evening with more questions than answers, unaware that a piece of information Reginald had uncovered during his investigation into the rumor's origin was about to reveal something far more significant than a simple case of household gossip, something that would ultimately determine not just Clara's place within the Ashworth family, but the very future of the estate itself. A week after the reporter published a follow-up article clearing Clara's name, Reginald asked for a private meeting with Edmund and Margaret in the estate's study. His expression was serious, carrying a thin folder of documents he had gathered during his investigation into the rumor's true origin. He explained that while Eleanor's careless words had sparked the initial gossip, someone else had deliberately fed the story to the journalist, shaping it into the damaging accusation that had spread so quickly through town. Edmund asked who was responsible. Reginald hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to reveal, before explaining that phone records and a conversation with the journalist's assistant pointed to Charles Bennett, a distant cousin of Edmund's late wife, who had long managed a portion of the estate's vineyard operations and had quietly expected to inherit a significant share of the property, given the absence of a finalized will. Charles had grown increasingly anxious in the weeks following Edmund's accident, worried that any romantic or familial attachment Edmund formed with someone new could threaten his own long-assumed claim to a portion of the estate. When he learned of Clara's growing closeness with Edmund, he saw her as a direct threat to his future security, and had taken it upon himself to discredit her before she could become a permanent fixture in the family's life. Margaret sat in stunned silence, struggling to process the revelation. She had known Charles for years, had always considered him a quiet, reliable presence around the estate, never suspecting he harbored such deep insecurity about his place within the family. Edmund's anger was immediate and sharp, disappointed not just by the betrayal itself, but by how close it had come to permanently damaging an innocent woman's reputation over nothing more than unfounded fear and greed. Edmund called Charles to the estate that same afternoon, confronting him directly with the evidence Reginald had gathered. Charles, cornered and unable to deny the accusations any longer, admitted everything, explaining through a mixture of shame and desperation how the uncertainty surrounding Edmund's estate plans had left him constantly anxious about his future, how seeing Clara grow close to Edmund had triggered fears he had been carrying silently for years. Edmund, though deeply disappointed, listened to Charles's explanation with more patience than anyone in the room expected. He acknowledged that his own failure to finalize a proper will had created an environment of uncertainty and fear among those who depended on the estate for their livelihood. An oversight, he now understood, had consequences far beyond simple legal paperwork. Still, he made clear that Charles's actions were unacceptable, regardless of the underlying anxiety that had driven them. Spreading false accusations to protect his own interests had caused real harm to an innocent person, and that could not be excused simply because his fears had some rational basis. Edmund informed Charles that he would no longer be involved in managing the vineyard operations, though he would not pursue any further legal action, given his cooperation in admitting the truth. With the true source of the scandal finally revealed, Edmund moved quickly to make things right. He personally called Clara, asking her to visit the estate one final time so he could share everything Reginald had uncovered. Clara arrived cautiously, still uncertain about her place within the complicated world she had been unexpectedly pulled into, but curious to hear what Edmund had to say. Edmund explained the full truth about Charles's involvement, apologizing sincerely for the pain the entire ordeal had caused her, acknowledging that his own family's unresolved issues had spilled over into her life through no fault of her own. Clara listened quietly, relief and lingering hurt mixing together, as she finally understood the full picture behind the scandal that had upended her life so completely. Edmund then told her something that caught her completely off guard. He explained that in the wake of everything that had happened, he had finally decided to finalize his will, a task he had avoided for years, despite everyone's urging. Among the provisions he intended to include was a modest but meaningful portion of the estate set aside for Clara, not as a romantic gesture, and not out of any sense of obligation, but as genuine recognition of what she had done for him, and the honest friendship she had shown him ever since, free of any hidden agenda. Clara immediately began to protest, insisting she did not need or want any part of his fortune, that her actions on the night of the accident had never been about receiving anything in return, and that accepting such a gift now would only invite more suspicion and complications into both their lives. Edmund gently reminded her that the entire scandal had proven exactly the opposite, that her repeated refusal to accept anything from him, even under pressure and public scrutiny, had been the clearest evidence of her true character all along. He told her that accepting his gratitude, in whatever form he chose to offer it, was not something she needed to be ashamed of or suspicious about. It was simply an honest acknowledgement of the bond they had built, a bond that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with genuine human connection. Margaret, present for the conversation, added her own voice, admitting that her earlier suspicions about Clara had been completely unfounded, and that she now understood how wrong she had been to doubt someone whose actions had consistently proven her sincerity, even when it would have been easier to simply walk away from the complications the Ashworth family had brought into her life. Clara, moved by their combined sincerity, finally agreed to accept a small provision within the will, though she insisted it be modest, far less than what Edmund initially proposed, wanting to avoid any appearance of exploiting the situation, despite everyone's reassurances. Edmund respected her wishes, finalizing the paperwork with his legal advisor in the following weeks, the entire family finally addressing the uncertainty that had lingered unresolved for far too long. In the months that followed, Clara's life slowly returned to a version of normal, though undeniably changed by everything that had happened. She continued working at the diner, refusing to let the events of the past months define her entirely, though she now visited Ashworth Estate regularly, her friendship with Edmund having grown into something steady and genuine, free from the suspicion and scandal that had once threatened to tear it apart. Margaret, having witnessed firsthand the strength of character Clara displayed throughout the entire ordeal, found herself developing a real friendship with her as well, the two women bonding over shared experiences neither had expected to have in common. The household staff, having watched the truth unfold and Charles's deception exposed, largely came to respect Clara as someone who had earned her place within their world through honesty rather than manipulation. Edmund, reflecting on everything that had happened since that snowy night on the Ridge Road, often thought about how close he had come to losing his life, and how the chain of events that followed had ultimately brought unexpected clarity to his family, forcing him to finally address issues he had avoided for years, and introducing him to a friendship that had reminded him what genuine human connection truly felt like. Clara, for her part, never regretted the decision she made that snowy night, pulling a stranger from a wrecked car without a second thought for what it might cost her. She had gained far more than she ever expected from that single act of kindness, not wealth or status, but a genuine friendship built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect, the kind of connection that no scandal or false accusation could ever fully take away. As the following winter approached, bringing with it the first snowfall of the season, Clara found herself once again driving along the familiar stretch of the Ridge Road, this time with no storm, no danger, simply a quiet drive toward the estate, for a dinner Edmund had invited her to share with him and Margaret. She glanced briefly at the spot where the accident had happened all those months ago, now nothing more than an ordinary stretch of road, forever marking the beginning of a friendship neither of them could have predicted, born from an unexpected act of kindness on the coldest night of the year. Spring arrived at Ashworth Estate with a warmth that felt long overdue after the harsh winter the family had endured. The vineyards, now under new management following Charles's departure, began showing signs of renewed life, rows of vines stretching across the hillside under careful tending from a manager Edmund had personally selected, someone with no ties to old family disputes or hidden agendas. Clara had become a familiar presence at the estate by then, no longer treated as an outsider or a subject of suspicion, but as someone genuinely woven into the fabric of the household's daily life. She often arrived after her shifts at the diner, sometimes tired, but always welcomed warmly, sharing dinner with Edmund and Margaret, the three of them settling into an easy rhythm that none of them could have predicted a year earlier. Margaret, in particular, found herself grateful for the friendship that had grown between her and Clara. The two women, so different in background yet similar in their quiet strength, had begun spending time together outside the estate as well, occasional lunches in town, long conversations about everything from family history to their own hopes for the future. Margaret admitted once, during one of these conversations, that she had spent years feeling isolated within her own family, caught between managing her father's expectations and her own unresolved grief over her mother's passing. Clara's honesty and openness had given her permission to finally speak about things she had kept buried for years. Eleanor, the housekeeper whose careless words had first sparked the damaging rumor, remained employed at the estate, though humbled by the experience. She approached Clara directly one afternoon, offering a sincere apology for the pain her words had caused, however unintentional the consequences had been. Clara, never one to hold on to bitterness longer than necessary, accepted the apology graciously, understanding that fear and insecurity, not malice, had driven Eleanor's initial comments. The two developed a cautious but genuine respect for one another in the months that followed. Charles Bennett, having lost his position managing the vineyard, moved away from the region entirely, taking a modest severance Edmund had offered, despite everything that had happened. Edmund, though he never fully forgave the depth of the betrayal, found some measure of peace in knowing he had handled the situation with fairness rather than pure anger, a choice that allowed the rest of the family to move forward without lingering resentment poisoning every gathering. Edmund's health continued to improve steadily as the months passed. The physical injuries from the accident long healed, though he often remarked that the emotional lessons from that snowy night had left a far more lasting impact than any broken bone ever could. He had learned, through nearly losing his life and then witnessing the fallout from years of avoided responsibility, that true wealth had little to do with property or fortune, and everything to do with the honesty and loyalty of the people who chose to remain by your side without expecting anything in return. He often told Clara, during their long conversations on the estate's veranda overlooking the vineyards, that meeting her had taught him more about genuine human connection than decades of business dealings and social obligations ever had. Clara always brushed off such compliments with the same humility she had shown from the very beginning, insisting she had simply done what anyone should do when they found someone in need of help. As the one-year anniversary of the accident approached, Edmund proposed a small gathering at the estate, inviting Clara, Margaret, Reginald, and a few close members of the household staff who had remained loyal throughout the entire ordeal. It was not a grand celebration, simply a quiet dinner meant to acknowledge how far they had all come since that night on the Ridge Road, and the unexpected friendships that had formed in its aftermath. Clara arrived that evening dressed simply, as always, feeling far more comfortable in the estate's grand dining room than she ever imagined she could a year earlier. Looking around the table at the people gathered there, people who had once viewed her with suspicion, curiosity, or outright hostility, now sharing genuine laughter and easy conversation, she felt a quiet sense of pride in how far they had all traveled together. Edmund raised a toast that evening, thanking everyone present for standing beside him and Clara through the difficulties of the past year, acknowledging openly how close the false accusations had come to destroying something genuinely good before it had a chance to fully take root. He spoke of gratitude, not just for being alive, but for the unexpected connections that had come from surviving that dangerous night, connections built on truth rather than convenience, and strengthened rather than broken by adversity. Clara, when it came her turn to speak, kept her words simple, thanking Edmund and Margaret for welcoming her into their lives, despite the complications her presence had unintentionally brought, and expressing how grateful she was to have found genuine friends in a family she never expected to become part of. She reminded everyone gently that the entire story had started with nothing more than an ordinary decision to stop and help a stranger in trouble, proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways no one could ever fully predict. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Edmund walked Clara to her car, the same modest vehicle that had once carried an injured stranger down a dangerous mountain road through a blinding snowstorm. He thanked her once more, not for saving his life this time, but simply for staying, for choosing honesty and friendship over the easier path of walking away when the scandal had threatened to consume her entirely. Clara smiled, telling him that she had never seriously considered leaving for good, that despite everything, the friendship they had built together had become one of the most meaningful relationships in her life. She drove home that night under a clear sky filled with stars, a stark contrast to the blinding snowstorm that had brought them together exactly 1 year earlier, reflecting on how a single decision made in the middle of a dangerous night had reshaped not just her own life, but the lives of everyone connected to Ashworth Estate. In the years that followed, Clara remained a steady presence in Edmund and Margaret's lives, her friendship with the family growing stronger with each passing season. She never forgot the lesson that Snowy Night had taught her, that genuine kindness, offered without expectation of reward, often led to consequences far greater and more meaningful than anyone could ever anticipate, transforming not just her own quiet, ordinary life, but the lives of an entire family who had needed, more than anything, a reminder of what honest human connection truly looked like.